Hello everyone, welcome back to my studio and a new sewing tutorial. Today I will show you how to make these really comfy and beautiful pants that look flattering on pretty much anyone. It's a really flattering cut for various different bodies and different shapes.
Ja, von vorne schaut's gut aus, finde ich. Und von der Seite auch.
So if you want to follow along, this is a sewing tutorial to do so. As always, you can find the sewing pattern on my website, so you can either print it by yourself at home, or we can ship you a printed version if that's more easier for you. So let's get started. I've already cut out the pieces from my fabric. I've tried these pants with two different fabrics, a bit of a heavier one, which is the black pair I've got. This is a more silky one, a lot thinner, and I will do the second pair in this kind of fabric. Like I said, it's a really easy pair of pants that pretty much look good on everyone, and it's also the issue with the fabric. No matter if you have a heavier fabric or a more lighter one, this cut pretty much works for almost everything. Very important, the pattern works for two different kinds of versions of these trousers. We've got a low waist one and a high waist one, depending on what you prefer to wear. And with you, I'm gonna sew the high waist one now. So I already cut out all of the pieces that I need. So altogether, you should have two front pieces, two back pieces, 4 pieces of the facing, and then also 4 pieces for the straps. The reason why these pair of trousers work so well on various kinds of bodies and shapes is because it doesn't really have a zipper or a button. These get tied in the front and in the back. So the sizing comes in a lot of variety. Definitely one of my favorite trousers at this point to wear. So like I said, I've got my fabric pieces ready and got them cut out. When cutting out the pieces, don't forget the grain line needs to be parallel to the selvage of the fabric. I marked the grain line onto all the pattern pieces so there is no confusion for you. Before we start sewing, we need to prepare all the fabric pieces. So we need to close all the edges of the fabric because they need to be neat and clean inside the garment, and ideally you should have an overlock. Don't worry if you don't have an overlock machine, you can use the zigzag stitch on your domestic sewing machine. And together we're gonna clean up all the edges of the pieces, and I'm gonna put an image onto the screen so you know which sides and which edges need to be cleaned up by the machine, so it's easier for you and you can follow along. The main pieces of the trousers are now mainly prepared. We're talking about the both front pieces and the both back pieces. I can put them to the side for now because we're gonna continue preparing the facings and also the strap. What I've got right here is a fusing. This is very important if you plan on using a thin fabric, because in some parts we need a bit more strength of the fabric, and the fusing is pretty much helping with that. Since I'm working with a thin fabric now, I'm gonna put this onto all of the facings and also onto the straps. For the black trousers, which is a lot more a heavier fabric and also a thicker one, I only use this for the facings. Of course, you can cut out all of the pieces from the fabric and then also from the fusing and then just press it. But there's actually an easier way, which is you have a piece of your fabric which just might have been a leftover from all the other pattern pieces that you've cut out. And then I just take my fusing and pretty much cut out a chunk that has the same size. Once you've prepared both of these pieces and it looks like this, you have to go to use your iron. Ideally, you would press this with a heat press, but I guess no one has one at home, so we're gonna use the iron. Press it really well and also make sure that it's not too hot, because otherwise you might actually melt the fusing. I prepared all the main pieces, and I'm not gonna act like that this just took me a quick second and everything went smoothly. No, my overlock machine decided to unthread itself an uncountable amount of times. So this actually took me like 2 hours to make. I hope you've got a bit more luck with your sewing machine because mine got some attitude. Finally, we are able to put the pieces together. First in the sewing process, I'll take the waistbands and close the center front and the center back with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. I then press the seam allowance apart and then go back to my overlock machine, or maybe in your case, your domestic sewing machine, and finish off the last edges of these pieces. Facing is now ready. And we're gonna go back to the main pieces of the trousers. So you basically need all 4 pieces because we need to do a lot of pressing before we can continue sewing it. So let me put everything to the side we don't need for right now. We've got 2 front pieces, 2 back pieces, and there on each piece there are... Just had a quick second of thoughts here if I say everything correctly. Well, you do have 2 sides on every single piece from the front and from the back, which needs to be pressed down in a certain way. So if you look at the pattern, you have a line at 3 centimeters, and these 3 centimeters needs to be pressed now. So we get this nice edge on all the open sides and also on the bottom of the trousers where the hem would usually be. I'm gonna put it onto the screen, which sides I mean, so you know exactly where to press it down. And of course, everything needs to be pressed down on the wrong side, so all the seam allowance, the 3 centimeter of seam allowance needs to be inside the trousers where you can't see them. Please take your time with that. When it comes to preparation processes, this needs to be done very carefully, otherwise you would have a really hard time sewing things together because seams will not match up or it will just look very wonky. Like you really need a straight edge on the bottom and also on the sides where the trousers will be open. So I'm gonna go to my iron and I will come back and show you what the pieces look like. I press down all the edges that need to be prepared and I help myself with my tape measure. So I just stand there at the iron board, always measure the 3 centimeters, like every 5 centimeters apart of a distance. And then I press these 5 centimeters down and that's how I get a pretty straight edge that has the exact width we need. Also make sure that where the seam allowance overlays, like the 3 centimeters from the one edge and then the other edge, it needs to be exactly 90 degrees so we can sew it a bit easier and it has a very specific finishing, which I'm going to show you very soon in this tutorial. We basically prepared the edges already and now we need to continue with the darts. I have 2 darts in the front and also 4 darts in the back. Listen, Hans, this is only for the trousers with the high waist. If you're trying to sew the low waist version, you don't need to do darts. It sits very low and darts just don't make any sense there. So you can pretty much skip that. You will even see on the pattern that the dart is just not even showing on your pattern piece if you do the low waist version. Since I'm working on the high waist version, I'm gonna do the darts. So like I said, we've got 2 darts in the front and 4 darts in the back, which I'm gonna close now and then I have to press them again. So do you, and then we can put the pieces together.
Might let you take me back. Take me back, baby. Take me back, baby, baby. Take me back, baby. Hindsight.
The next step we have to do. We are gonna close the insides of the trousers now. So you have to take 1 back piece each and then 1 front piece each. You can define them very easily now because the back pieces got the 2 darts and the front pieces got just 1 dart. If you're doing the low hip version, well, I'm sorry, you've got to check the pattern again if you're unsure about which piece is which. But honey, you're gonna get some really cute trousers right there. So, got a back piece and a front piece. You have to put the right size, the sides that are usually outside when you wear them, you have to put them on top of each other so they're inside, and then you're gonna start pinning the seam that is gonna be on the inside of your leg. The 3 centimeter we pressed down earlier, you have to fold them up and sew them as well. And I'm gonna continue pinning everything together, and then I'm gonna stitch it down with 1 centimeter of seam allowance. And then I'm gonna go back to my iron and I'm gonna press the seam apart because it needs to be very neat and very flat. And you basically repeat the steps with the other side of your trousers. After I close the seam on the inside leg, I put both sides on top of each other and close the center front and the center back. Make sure that the seams of the center front and the center back match up perfectly. I then pin it all the way around and sew it at a seam allowance of 1 centimeter. Once again, you have to press it apart with the iron so the seam is nice and flat. If you wouldn't know how these trousers are supposed to be worn, you would think that I've done something wrong with the measuring. But I think you can see where this is going. I also like the flow of the fabric, to be honest. Compared to the black ones, which has the heavier, thicker fabric, I feel that this one is gonna be a lot more easier to wear and a lot more comfortable. The other one, I'm not gonna lie, it looks great, but it's quite heavy. I mean, you've gotta think, this is a lot of fabric, and if it's a heavier one as well, you've got to carry it. But the black one is surely gonna be worn as well. It shouldn't be that bad, right? Well, I'm excited. Can you even see? We've done good so far. Next step is to put in the facing of the waist. Please double check that you've got the right facing for each of the sides. You need to have one front facing and one back facing. So once you've figured out which piece goes where, I'm gonna show you how to pin it in, and then we're gonna stitch it down with 1 centimeter of seam allowance, and then your waistband is stitched in as well. To put in the waistband, you have to pin it in from the right side of your trouser. You match up the center back seams and the center front seams, and then basically pin it all the way around the waist. Very important to know, the facing of the waist is 2 centimeters shorter than the trouser pieces. This is perfectly fine for the kind of finishing of the corners we are doing. The facing of the waist needs to be stitched down at 1 centimeter seam allowance. The seam itself needs to be starting and ending at the crease you created when we pressed down the 3 centimeters during the preparation process. In order to completely finish the facing, we need to do a second seam. You fold the facing up and the seam allowance needs to be right under the facing. You go back to your sewing machine and you stitch it down at 1 millimeter. This seam needs to be on the facing as well and basically secures the seam allowance onto it. It's time to finish the corners of the trousers. So you've got 4 corners on the upper part of the trousers at the waistbands, and then on the bottom you've got 8 corners in total, and we need to close all of them. Closing the corners is not that difficult, and I'm gonna show you how. First of all, you need some form of ruler. Ideally, a ruler who has a 90-degree angle marked on it. You also need some form of chalk or maybe some other way of marking the fabric. We've got 2 lines we need to mark first. One line is the 3 centimeters we prepared beforehand and pressed down. Basically just have to mark the crease, the one on the bottom and the one on the side. For the waistbands, we've got the 3 centimeters, which is the first line, and the second line is the waistband seam. I marked these 2 lines so I can see them a bit better and I have an easier time marking the initial line where we need to cut. So I put the ruler exactly into this corner with the 90 degrees and then I shift it for another centimeter which we need for the seam allowance. Once I mark the spot where to cut, I take my fabric scissors and cut the edge off. I then fold this new cut and then pin it together. This is with 1 centimeter of seam allowance where we need to do another seam. Once I stitched it together, I go back to my fabric scissors and trim the seam allowance for a bit, especially the corner. I then spread the seam allowance apart and then turn the corner inside out. I also help myself with the fabric scissors to really get the corner out and into a nice 90-degree angle. To finish it off, I go back to my iron and then spread the corner nicely so everything is flat and neat. For comparison, here's what it looks like when you finish the corners on the waist. I just pressed down all the edges, so you basically just have to take care of the seam allowance to make sure that it's spread apart and you press it really neatly and flat. You might need to go in with your scissors to get the edge and the corner out really nicely, but then once it's done, it should look, very neat, and we are pretty close to finishing the trousers. So I'm gonna put my pair of trousers to the side for now, and we're gonna focus on the straps. The straps are very easy to make, it just takes a bit of patience, especially with the edge stitch, but I'm sure you can do it. To make the straps is fairly easy. You take a piece, you fold it into half, which will mark the center of the strap. You then take each of the side of the strap and then fold it towards the mark in the middle. You then fold it once again in the middle, and then you will soon realize that you pretty much got the strap finished. One end of the strap needs to be open and the other end of the strap needs to be closed. So you fold it once and once again stitch it down with your sewing machine. We are almost close to finishing the trousers, and this step I'm gonna do right now is optional, but I very much recommend it because whenever you're gonna wash these trousers, you then have to repress all the edges that we prepared before. Like, you remember the 3 centimeters, we just pressed on basically a lot of these edges. I always stitch things down so I don't have to do a lot more pressing and ironing, because I'm not a huge fan of it. So what I do now is I will stitch down 3mm next to all of the edges and kind of give it a really nice finishing. Don't forget, these are top stitches you will see very, very much. So take your time, make sure that your bobbin is full of thread because you don't want to run out of it in the middle of the seam, because, well, that doesn't look as neat as it should. And you basically really stitch down all around. You don't even have to stop. You just start at one specific place that you think you don't see the lock stitch too much, and then you just follow every edge, and you soon will realize that you will come back to the one place where you started your seam and ended right there. So that is very convenient, but like I said, it's a pretty long top stitch, so make sure your bobbin is not running out of thread throughout the whole process. If you stitch down all the edges like I did, please give it a good press once again so the edges are completely finished. We are definitely almost done with the machine stitching, and for the end result we need to do a bit of hand stitching, but more about that later on. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add the straps. I thought it would look really cute if I did some shorter ones, some shorter ones in the front and then some longer ones for the back. So you basically can adjust the straps however you want. That's really up to you. You might even want to, put some more stitching on it. These are your pairs of trousers, so you can make them look the way you want them to look. So I'm gonna go take my ruler, and then I will measure out right from the edge. I will measure in 1.5 centimeters on all 4 sides of the waistband. So you got the open sides of the waistband, and you've got like corners on the left and the right part of it for the front and the back. So there where these 4 straps need to go. And I will go now to my sewing machine and show you how you need to sew them on. It's so hard sometimes to find the right music for sewing tutorials, like sometimes it feels a bit too energetic. So as the last step, we're gonna do some blind stitches. And they're very easy, as always. I always say things are easy, but they really are once you know how to do them. First of all, thread your sewing needle. On the inside of the facing, just do a couple of stitches in the same place to make a knot. Then right to where the facing is ending on the trousers, I make sure to only pick up one of the fibers of the woven fabric and hold it with my needle and pinch through. I then stitch through the facing with a distance of 1/2 centimeter, and there you have it, your first blind stitch. You repeat this on all of the sides with the loose facings and the loose 3 centimeters repressed until you're back to the same spot where you started. Also double check on the outside of your trousers if any of your stitches are visible. They should not be, and that's why they're called blind stitches.